The law is supposed to protect you. But what if it's designed to break you instead? When Olivia Carter was pulled over that night, she wasn't just another black woman in the wrong neighborhood. She was a federal prosecutor, a woman who had spent her career fighting for justice. But the officers who arrested her didn't know that. And when they shoved her into the system she once trusted, they didn't realize they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. Now, Olivia has two choices: stay silent and let corruption win, or use her arrest to bring the whole system crashing down. But how do you fight a system that was never built for you? Do you believe the justice system protects everyone equally? Or does power decide who gets justice? Share your thoughts below. Now let's step into Olivia Carter's world. The night she learned that justice isn't given. It's taken. The night smelled of cold asphalt and distant rain. From behind the wheel of her silver Mercedes, Olivia Carter exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders, trying to shake off the exhaustion from another 14-hour day. The Thompson case had consumed her for weeks: depositions, motions, late-night strategy sessions, but now, for the first time all day, she was alone. The streets of Boston stretched before her, quiet, still. But something about the silence felt wrong. She glanced in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser, a block behind her. It had been there for a while. She ignored the prickle at the back of her neck, told herself she was imagining things. She had done nothing wrong. She knew the law. She had spent her career defending it, wielding it, trusting it. But tonight, trust felt like a mistake. Her fingers drummed against the wheel as she took a slow breath. I always thought the law would protect us. But tonight, I learned something else. The law only protects those it was built for. Flashing blue and red lights filled her mirrors. Her stomach tightened, but her hands stayed steady. She eased the car to the curb, shifting into park. Engine off, hands on the wheel, standard protocol. But she already knew this wasn't about a stop sign. A cruiser rolled up behind her, its headlights slicing through the dark. Two officers stepped out. Ethan Pierce, Greg Lawson. She didn't know their names, but she knew their type. The ones who used the law not to protect, but to control. Pierce approached first, his hand resting on his holster. Casual, but intentional. License and registration. His tone was flat, not a request, a command. Olivia turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze through the open window. "Of course, officer," she said, keeping her voice neutral. Calm, but not submissive. She moved carefully, reaching toward her glove compartment, then froze. Pierce had tensed, his fingers curled tighter, a silent warning. She had seen this moment before. Not in her own life, but in case files, court transcripts, evidence exhibits marked in red. It didn't matter that she was innocent. It only mattered what they wanted to believe. She slowly brought her hands back to the wheel. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" Lawson stepped in now, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He smirked. "You rolled through a stop sign back there." A lie. Olivia had stopped. She always stopped. But rules didn't matter when the game was rigged. She studied their faces, measuring them. That's when she saw it, the flicker of irritation in Pierce's eyes. He wasn't used to being questioned. Lawson's smirk widened. "Step out of the car." She hesitated, not because she planned to argue, but because she knew what came next. The moment she stepped out, she was no longer Olivia Carter, federal prosecutor. She was just a black woman on a cold city street. And that meant none of her credentials mattered. She unbuckled her seatbelt, inhaled deeply, and pushed open the door. The night air was sharp against her skin. Pierce moved in, flashlight sweeping over her body. He wasn't looking for weapons, he was looking for an excuse. Nothing. But that didn't stop him. Hands on the hood. She didn't move, not out of defiance, but because something had changed. The air shifted. A new presence. A bystander. A young man, maybe early 20s, phone raised, recording. Lawson saw him too. "Put the phone down," he snapped. The young man didn't move. He was witnessing. Pierce moved fast. Too fast. 1 second, the phone was in the young man's hand. The next, he was slammed against the wall, Pierce's forearm pressing into his back. "You resisting, huh?" "I was just filming." "Not anymore." Phone gone. Evidence erased. Olivia clenched her jaw, nails digging into her palms. It was all so predictable. She had fought for people like this young man before. Stood in courtrooms, argued for justice, exposed corruption. But now she was living it. Pierce turned back to her, his smirk returning. "Turn around." She exhaled slowly. Then she did. Cold metal snapped around her wrists. The handcuffs were tighter than they needed to be. But that wasn't the point, was it? This wasn't about law. This was about power. And for the first time in her life, Olivia Carter wasn't standing in a courtroom. She was standing on the wrong side of the system she once believed in. The station smelled like old sweat, cheap coffee, and something rotten beneath layers of disinfectant. Like the place had been scrubbed clean of the visible mess, but the real filth was buried deep. Olivia Carter had spent years in places like this, not in a holding cell, but on the other side of the law, standing behind podiums, arguing cases. She had walked into precincts with her badge clipped to her blazer, commanding respect with nothing more than a glance. Tonight, none of that mattered. Her hands, now red and raw from the cuffs, had been stripped of power. She felt the cold metal bite into her skin one last time before Officer Pierce unclipped them and shoved her forward. "You know the drill," he muttered. "Turn around." She did. Not because she wanted to, because she had no choice. The officer at the desk didn't even look up. "Name?" he asked, voice as dull as the overhead lights. "Olivia Carter." That made him glance up, just for a second, a flicker of recognition. Then gone. Pierce smirked beside her. "That's right," he said, tone smug. "She's a lawyer, thinks that makes her special." He reached down, clicked his radio twice, short bursts of static. A signal. Olivia noticed. She didn't say a word. Instead, she focused on the desk, on the cardboard box waiting to swallow her identity. Her watch, the one her mother gave her when she passed the bar exam. Her phone, the one that held every contact, every lifeline. Her purse, gone. Her entire life reduced to a numbered property slip. Then came the final blow. "I need to make a call." The officer at the desk didn't even blink. Phones are down. A lie, obvious, blatant. From where she stood, Olivia could see the station phone blinking, an open line. She could hear officers laughing in the background, talking on their own cell phones. It wasn't about policy, it was about power. The door slammed shut behind her. The holding cell was small, damp, and smelled of too many bodies and too little air. The walls held stories, and none of them had happy endings. She wasn't alone. Two women sat on the hard metal bench against the far wall. One was young, early 20s, maybe. Fierce but exhausted. Her hands were curled into fists, her body coiled like a loaded spring. The other was older, mid-40s, with tired eyes and a sadness that seemed to sink into her bones. Lillian and Tasha. They barely acknowledged Olivia. Women like them had learned not to expect help from strangers. Lillian was shaking. Her sleeves were damp, whether from sweat or tears, Olivia couldn't tell. Then, barely above a whisper, "My son." Olivia turned, really looking at her now. "I don't know where they took my son." Lillian's fingers twisted the hem of her shirt. "They arrested him yesterday," she said, voice breaking. "Said he fit a description. I kept calling, kept coming back, but they wouldn't tell me anything. Then tonight, they arrested me for trespassing. Said I was causing a disturbance." She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for her child. Something cold settled in Olivia's chest. Lillian had done nothing wrong, but innocence had never been a shield. And then there was Tasha. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even looking at Olivia. Her eyes were fixed on the metal bars, rage simmering just beneath her skin. "How many times?" Olivia asked softly. Tasha turned now, sharp, wary. "What? How many times have they done this to you?" A bitter laugh. "I stopped counting." She leaned back against the wall, exhaling through her nose, trying to keep control. "It's always the same," she muttered. "They pick me up, hold me overnight, slap me with some bullshit charge, and then throw me back out. And if I fight it, the charges stick. If I plead guilty, it's just another stat for them, another mark on my record." She turned to Olivia now, really looking at her for the first time. "You're new to this, huh?" Olivia hesitated. For the first time, she felt ashamed of her own privilege. She had spent years in courtrooms, standing behind podiums, filing motions, always believing that the law was something she could control if she was smart enough, if she worked hard enough. But here, in this place, the law wasn't a shield. It was a weapon. And for the first time in her career, she was on the wrong end of it. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, inhaling through her nose, forcing herself to process what she was feeling. This wasn't just a bad night. This wasn't just about her. This was a system. A system designed to keep people like Lillian in fear. A system designed to break people like Tasha. And now it had come for her. She opened her eyes. She had two choices. She could let this night be the end of something. Or she could make sure it was only the beginning. The station had its own rhythm. The hum of fluorescent lights, the low murmur of officers trading jokes over stale coffee, the distant clang of cell doors shutting, sealing people away like afterthoughts. Olivia Carter knew the sound of bureaucracy in motion, how smoothly the gears turned when the system wanted to forget someone. Tonight, she was the one they wanted to forget. She sat on the hard bench outside the holding cells, her hands still aching from the cuffs. They hadn't offered her water. They hadn't told her when she could call a lawyer. The rules didn't apply here. Not for her. Not for anyone like her. Then she heard it. A voice, one she hadn't heard in years. Jason Holloway. A shadow of a man she once knew. Jason Holloway had been one of the bright ones. Years ago, when Olivia was a young federal prosecutor, they had worked cases together, debated legal strategies over late-night takeout, argued about the fine lines of justice. Back then, he had ideals, or at least, she thought he did. Now, standing in the doorway of the booking office, he looked different. Not older, not worn down. Comfortable, the kind of comfort that came from never fighting battles you knew you couldn't win. He didn't look at her right away. Didn't even flinch when he saw her name on the arrest log. Just another case. Just another file. Olivia waited for recognition. Waited for him to say something, anything. But he didn't. Instead, he picked up the clipboard and began flipping through paperwork, his eyes scanning like she was nothing more than an administrative task. Then finally, "Olivia Carter," he said, almost to himself. Flat. Detached. Like her name was just another line item in his shift report. She studied him carefully, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers tapped against the desk. A tell. "You knew I was here," she said. He didn't answer right away, just turned a page, signing something with a flourish. "Of course I knew," he finally said, but there was something off in his voice. Not regret, something colder. Resignation. Olivia leaned forward, her voice low but sharp. "Let me guess, my bail's being processed but there's a holdup in the system?" Holloway exhaled through his nose, a flicker of irritation. "These things take time," he said, scribbling something onto a document. Olivia didn't blink. "Cut the bullshit, Jason." That made him look up. For a moment she saw it, the ghost of the man she once knew, and just as quickly it was gone. "I don't control these things, Olivia." A lie. She knew exactly how this worked. Knew that he could clear her for release in minutes if he wanted to. But he wasn't going to, because someone didn't want her to walk out of here tonight. She sat back, inhaling deeply, forcing herself to think. Who was pulling the strings? Who had called in this favor? "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. Holloway hesitated, barely, but she caught it. "Do what?" he said, feigning confusion. She tilted her head, studying him. "Play along." His jaw twitched. For the first time, he didn't have a scripted answer. She saw something flicker across his face. Not guilt, not fear. Something worse, acceptance. He had made his choice a long time ago. He closed the folder with a soft thud and slid it into the stack on his desk. "You'll get your phone call," he said, but there was no weight behind it. No urgency. Just a hollow promise in a room full of empty ones. Then he turned and walked away. The station felt different now. Not just cold. Not just stale, tainted. It was in the way the officers moved, too casual, too rehearsed. The way conversations dropped when Olivia Carter walked past. The way she could feel herself being watched, monitored, managed. She had seen this before. Not from the inside, but in court, in cases she had prosecuted. She wasn't just another arrest. She was a problem to be handled. And someone with power, had just given the order to make sure she stayed that way. She didn't see Officer Ethan Pierce take the call at first. She heard it, the faint buzz of his radio, the clipped, low response. "Yeah," a pause. Then his voice lowered, but not low enough. "She's here." Olivia turned slightly on the hard bench outside the holding cell, shifting just enough to get a glimpse of him. Pierce was standing near the booking desk, his body language changing subtly. His posture, once relaxed, was now taut. Not tense, just deliberate, listening. Calculating. No, she's not going anywhere. Her pulse kicked up. She wasn't supposed to hear that, But he had turned his back to her just enough, a move she recognized instantly. It was the same move a witness made on the stand when they weren't sure how much they should admit. Not hiding, managing. A few more words. Low, controlled. Then a short burst of static. Call ended. Pierce exhaled slowly, clipped his radio back onto his belt, then turned just enough to catch her watching him. For the first time since she'd been brought in, he smiled. Not smug, not cruel. Worse, confident. Like a man who already knew how this was going to end. Like a man who had just been given permission to take his time. The Thompson case. That was the only explanation. She had spent the last 6 months building it, painstakingly, methodically, connecting corruption to names that weren't supposed to be touched. Names that belonged to judges, prosecutors, police captains, people who had enough influence to make problems disappear. And now, she was the problem. A woman who was supposed to be in court tomorrow morning, arguing against them. Instead, she was sitting in a police station that had no intention of letting her go. Her fingers curled into fists. They hadn't just arrested her. They had removed her. She turned back toward the booking desk. Pierce was watching her now. Not in the way a cop watches a suspect, in the way a hunter watches something that's already caught in the trap. Her pulse steadied. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She lifted her chin slightly. Held his gaze, a challenge. His expression didn't change, but she caught the flicker of something. Just for a second. Interest. He leaned slightly toward the officer next to him, speaking low, but this time he didn't bother hiding it. She's not going anywhere. Then he picked up her file and smiled. The holding cell was too small for so much pain. It clung to the walls, settled into the cracks of the cold concrete floor, pressed down on the women inside like a weight that wouldn't lift. Olivia Carter had spent years reading about cases like this. She had studied them in legal briefs, presented them as evidence in court, debated them in high-stakes trials where statistics were thrown around like currency. But here, in this dimly lit, stale-smelling cell, those statistics had faces. And suddenly, they weren't just numbers anymore. Lillian sat on the bench, hunched forward, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold something inside that had already shattered. Her hands trembled slightly. Her breath was uneven. "My son," she whispered again, as if saying it out loud might make him reappear. "I just wanted to know where they took my son." Her voice was small, too small for a mother's rage. Olivia turned toward her. "Start from the beginning," she said softly. Lillian exhaled shakily, blinking fast, like she was trying to push back the tears before they started. "He's 16, she began. "Just a kid." She took another breath, but it came out in a shaky, fractured exhale. "I heard the yelling outside. I ran to the door." Her voice caught and she closed her eyes, shaking her head. He was on the ground, face down, hands behind his back. Her fingers curled into fists. They weren't arresting him. Her voice was flat now. They were beating him. The words landed like a punch. "I ran out, screaming at them to stop," she continued. "Told them he was just a kid, that he didn't do anything wrong. They told me to back off. I didn't, so they arrested me too." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Trespassing," she said. "That's what they charged me with. Disturbing the peace." She exhaled, shaking her head slowly. "I don't even know where they took him." A heavy silence followed, the kind that fills up a space and makes it unbearable. Olivia's mind spun, but her stomach twisted. She had seen this before, not firsthand, but in reports, in the missing person cases that never got media attention, in the mothers who stood outside police stations waiting for answers that never came. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "We'll find him." The words came out before she could think them through. Lillian looked at her then, really looked at her. And for the first time since Olivia had been dragged into this place, she felt like someone saw her as something more than just another prisoner. "It's a business," Tasha said suddenly. Her voice wasn't shaky. It wasn't broken. It was sharp, angry, familiar. Olivia turned to her. Tasha's body was rigid, her arms crossed, jaw clenched tight. "It's not about crime," she continued. "It's about numbers, quotas, arrest counts. That's what keeps their funding rolling in." Olivia studied her. "You've been through this before," Tasha scoffed. "Try more times than I can count." She exhaled slowly, forcing her shoulders to relax against the cold wall. "They set the targets. 10 arrests a week, 20 if they can push it. Doesn't matter if the person actually did anything, just that they get booked, processed, and logged. Olivia clenched her fists. She had read about these unspoken quotas. She had even suspected them in certain precincts. But now she was sitting next to someone who had lived it. Tasha looked at her now, her eyes hard. "You ever been on this side before, lawyer?" The way she said lawyer was almost an accusation. Olivia didn't flinch. "No," she admitted. Tasha held her gaze for a long moment. Then she gave the smallest nod. "Not in trust. Not yet, but in understanding. They pick people like me because they know we can't fight back," she continued. "I've got 2 priors, both bullshit charges, but they're on my record. And that means every time they arrest me, the system already assumes I'm guilty." She let out a dry laugh. "So I stopped fighting it. Just take the plea, do the time, get out and wait for them to come back again." She wasn't being sarcastic. She wasn't exaggerating. She was stating a fact, and Olivia hated that she understood it now. She memorized everything, every charge, every tactic, every pattern. This wasn't just a bad arrest. This was a machine designed to keep power in the right hands and everyone else in cages. She looked back at Tasha, at Lillian. They weren't just victims of circumstance. They were evidence. And for the first time since she had been dragged into this place, Olivia Carter felt like a prosecutor again. Because now, she had a case to build. The pieces were falling into place. Not all at once, not in a way that was obvious, but in the quiet, creeping realization that this had all been planned long before she ever set foot in this cell. Olivia Carter sat still, her mind working faster than her heartbeat. Lillian's son, Tasha's endless cycle of arrests, quotas, disappearances. A system that didn't just fail, it functioned exactly as it was designed, and she had seen it before. She just hadn't known where to look, until now. Olivia had worked hundreds of cases in her career as a federal prosecutor. Some had been routine, some had been high profile, and some had never sat right with her. Cases where evidence disappeared, where key witnesses recanted or vanished, where defendants took plea deals despite overwhelming proof of their innocence. And through all of it, 2 names kept surfacing: Judge Robert Sinclair and Prosecutor Jason Holloway. Sinclair had a reputation for being tough on crime. He rarely granted bail, handed down the harshest sentences possible, and had never ruled in favor of a police misconduct case. Holloway, he was the kind of prosecutor who never lost, not because he was good, but because he made sure he wouldn't. Fabricated evidence, suppressed reports, deals with judges behind closed doors. Olivia had suspected, but she had never had enough proof to take it further. Now, she was proof. She was living inside the very system she had spent years defending, and the system was rotting from the inside out. The metal door at the far end of the holding area buzzed loudly before swinging open. A uniformed officer stepped inside, eyes scanning the room. Then, behind him, a familiar face. Marcus Torres, FBI special agent, and once a friend. Olivia felt her stomach tighten. Torres had been one of the good ones. Years ago, they had worked side by side, tackling corruption cases that no one else wanted to touch. He was sharp, methodical, and he didn't scare easily. But now he looked furious. "Carter," he said, stepping forward. His voice was controlled, but tense. The officer blocked his path. "She's in holding," the officer said, his tone flat. "FBI has no jurisdiction here." Torres barely spared the man a glance. "She's a federal prosecutor. You don't get to deny her legal counsel." The officer shrugged. "Orders came from above." Olivia's stomach sank further. "How high above?" she asked, her voice calm. The officer didn't answer, but he didn't need to, because the look on Torres's face told her everything. Whoever was pulling the strings wasn't just local. This went higher than just a judge, higher than just a corrupt prosecutor. This was systemic, and someone wanted her out of the way. Torres exhaled sharply, then stepped forward again, this time lowering his voice. "I can't get you out of here," he said. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." Olivia nodded once. She had already known the answer. They weren't going to let her walk. Not until whoever was behind this was sure she was neutralized. So, she did what she did best. She thought, she analyzed, she built a case. Right there in that cell, Olivia Carter began putting the pieces together. Because if they thought she was just another victim of the system, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The air in the holding cell had shifted, not just in temperature, in weight. There was something new pressing against Olivia's senses now. Not just injustice, not just corruption. Danger. Real. Immediate. Close. And she wasn't the only one who felt it. It came from the farthest corner of the cell. A voice. Low, rough, worn from too many cigarettes and too many nights in places like this. "You think you're just here to sit?" Olivia turned. The woman who spoke had deep-set eyes and a face lined with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from knowing too much. She didn't look at Olivia directly, just stared at the concrete wall like she'd seen this play out before. "They don't just hold people like you," she muttered. Olivia's spine stiffened. "What do you mean?" A slow inhale, a long pause, then, "A guy was in here last month, said the same things you're saying, talking about how he was going to take them all down." Another pause, a longer exhale. "Next morning, they found him hanging in his cell." Olivia's breath hitched. She had seen cases like that before. Cases where the official report would call it suicide. Cases where the cameras just happened to be malfunctioning that night. Cases where the officers who had been on duty would swear they didn't hear a thing. Her pulse pounded. She wasn't just a prisoner in the system. She was a loose end. And loose ends? They got cut. The pattern was clear now. She was arrested under false pretenses. Her bail was intentionally delayed. Her presence here was ordered by someone high up. Now, she was being warned, just like someone else had been before they disappeared. She was never supposed to leave this cell. Not alive. A cold sweat broke out along the back of her neck. They didn't just want her case to disappear. They wanted her to disappear. Permanently. She forced herself to stay still. To think, not react. She was being watched. By who, she didn't know. Maybe one of the officers. Maybe one of the inmates. Maybe someone who was waiting for the right moment. She had to act fast. The courtroom felt different when you were the one standing at the defense table. Olivia Carter had spent years commanding rooms like this, presenting airtight cases, wielding the law like a scalpel. Now, she stood in front of a judge who had already decided her fate before she even walked in. And she wasn't the one holding the scalpel. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and Olivia was led inside, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. The shackles around her wrists and ankles were cold, heavy, unnecessary. She wasn't a flight risk. She wasn't a violent offender. But they weren't for security. They were for the optics, for the journalists watching, for the whispered conversations in the gallery, for the jury pool that didn't even exist yet, but whose opinions were already being shaped. She lifted her chin, scanning the room, and then she saw him. Judge Robert Sinclair. He looked exactly as she remembered. Gray hair slicked back, face expressionless, the kind of man who had perfected the art of pretending to be impartial. He wasn't. He had never been. The man who had never ruled in favor of a police misconduct case. The man who had sentenced first and justified later. The man whose signature had appeared on countless rulings that protected corrupt officers and silenced victims. And now he was staring down at her. Not with interest, not with consideration, with certainty, because he already knew how today was going to end. "Your Honor," Jason Holloway began, his voice smooth, rehearsed. Olivia didn't react. She had known this was coming. He had buried evidence, ignored procedures, weaponized the system before. Today he was just doing it in front of an audience. "The state requests that bail be set at $500,000, he continued. A murmur spread through the gallery. Even some of the journalists exchanged surprised glances. $500,000 for a fabricated charge, for a woman with no criminal record, for a traffic stop that was never about a traffic stop. Judge Sinclair barely blinked. "On what grounds?" Holloway smirked. "Flight risk," he said without hesitation. That was the game. Set bail so high that it was the same as denying it altogether. Make sure she didn't walk out of here. Make sure she stayed in the system long enough for something to happen. Olivia's stomach coiled. They weren't even pretending anymore. This wasn't about justice. This was about erasing her. Sinclair leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He gave the appearance of deliberation, as if he hadn't already made up his mind. The silence stretched, long enough for the press to take note, long enough for the tension to settle in Olivia's bones. Then, bail is set at $500,000. A gavel. A decision that was never in doubt. The courtroom erupted into hushed conversation. Holloway barely concealed his satisfaction. The officers moved to escort her away, and Olivia felt it settle in her chest. The cold, hard truth. She had seen this before. Defendants, trapped in a system that was designed to keep them here. People who thought the law would protect them. People who thought the courtroom was a place for justice. And now, she was one of them. She turned her head slightly, scanning the gallery, looking for something. Anything. A reporter who looked uneasy. A clerk who shifted in his seat. Someone who could see what was happening. But all she saw were pens scribbling, cameras clicking, and eyes that had already accepted the story they were going to print. She was alone in this fight. For now. The courtroom wasn't quiet anymore. It wasn't just the faint scratch of pens on notepads, the low hum of whispered speculation. It was the shift, the sudden, almost imperceptible shift, when power starts slipping from the hands of those who thought they owned it. Olivia Carter felt it. The moment the heavy wooden doors burst open. The moment all eyes turned to the man stepping through. Agent Marcus Torres, tall, unshaken, holding a document that had just changed everything. Torres moved with deliberate control, his presence commanding the room before he even spoke. "Your Honor," his voice cut clean through the stagnant air. "I have here an official FBI warrant for immediate investigation into judicial misconduct and conspiracy to obstruct justice." The ripple through the courtroom was palpable. Judge Robert Sinclair stiffened ever so slightly behind his bench. Jason Holloway didn't move, but Olivia saw it, the briefest flicker of tension in his jaw, the tightening of his grip around his briefcase. The officers standing beside Olivia shifted uncomfortably, their hands twitching near their belts. They all felt it now. This wasn't just a courtroom proceeding anymore. This was a reckoning. Torres gave a sharp nod to an agent at the back of the courtroom. A screen flickered to life. And then, a grainy, black and white security feed filled the room. The timestamp in the corner, the night of Olivia's arrest. The room held its breath. And then, two figures appeared on screen. Ethan Pierce, Greg Lawson, two uniformed officers, standing in the shadows of an underground parking lot, waiting. A third figure entered the frame, and the moment he did, Olivia felt her stomach coil. She knew him. So did half the people in this room. A high-ranking official, a man whose name had appeared in more than one corruption case Olivia had investigated, the man who had ordered her arrest. And then, a briefcase was exchanged, a quick nod, and then, just as fast as it began, the deal was done. A figure in uniform pocketed an envelope tucked inside. It was a transaction. Cold, efficient, undeniable. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Even Judge Sinclair's fingers twitched on the bench. And Jason Holloway? For the first time today, his mask cracked, because he knew what everyone had just seen. It wasn't just a bribe, it was proof. Proof that Olivia's arrest had been bought and paid for. Proof that the scales of justice had been weighted long before she ever set foot in this room. Torres wasn't finished. He turned, his stance firm, his words razor-sharp. "In addition to this footage, we have secured records detailing a list of unlawful arrests made over the past 2 years. A thick folder landed on the judge's bench with a heavy thud. All approved by your court, Your Honor." Judge Sinclair didn't move. He didn't speak. But Olivia saw it. The rigid set of his shoulders, the way his fingers curled just slightly against the wood of his desk. Because for the first time in his career, he was no longer the most powerful man in the room. Torres let the silence settle. "Then, we have evidence of fabricated charges, coerced confessions, and undisclosed financial transactions linking members of law enforcement to high-ranking officials in exchange for convictions." Every word landed like a hammer. And Olivia? She watched. Watched as Jason Holloway gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a way out. Watched as Judge Sinclair's carefully crafted facade cracked, piece by piece. Watched as the walls of this system, this machine, started to shake. She should have felt relief. She should have felt vindicated. But as she watched Holloway's jaw tighten, watched Sinclair's hands flex against his bench, she felt something else, something darker. For years she had believed in the law, believed that the system could work if only the right people were in place. But what if it couldn't? What if this wasn't about reform? What if the system wasn't broken? What if this was exactly how it was designed to work? Her nails dug into her palms. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This wasn't just a case. This was a war. And now she knew exactly who she was fighting. The courtroom was no longer a battlefield. It was a wreckage site. The carefully constructed pillars of power, the judge's authority, the prosecutor's control, the officer's silence, all of it was crumbling. And standing in the middle of it all, Olivia Carter watched the system that had tried to destroy her collapse under its own weight. The room had changed. It wasn't just the murmurs rippling through the crowd, or the way reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. It was the fear. Not from the innocent. From those who had built their careers on lies. Torres didn't rush. He let the tension stretch, let the reality sink in. Then, Judge Robert Sinclair, Prosecutor Jason Holloway, your names appear in multiple financial records linking you to organized bribery and wrongful convictions. Your signatures authorized fabricated charges, denied bail to innocent civilians, and ensured convictions that had nothing to do with the law. Every word landed like a sledgehammer. Sinclair's face remained blank, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the bench. Holloway, standing beside him, wasn't so composed. His breath came a little too fast. His fingers twitched a little too much. The noose was tightening, and they both knew it. Sinclair finally leaned forward. "This is outrageous," he said, his voice carefully even. But Olivia heard it, the crack, the slightest tremor underneath the forced control. "I have dedicated my life to this court, to justice." Olivia didn't blink. Neither did Torres, because the moment Sinclair had to say it out loud, he had already lost. Holloway's mask slipped first. He turned to Sinclair as if looking for a lifeline. None came. Then he moved. It happened fast. A sudden lunge, a desperate motion toward the side exit of the courtroom. A run. A pathetic, scrambling coward's attempt at escape. For a man who had spent years trapping others in the system, he had no idea how to survive outside of it. The doors never opened for him, because the moment his foot crossed the threshold, FBI agents swarmed. Torres didn't even flinch as Holloway was slammed against the nearest wall, his arms yanked behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent," an agent said. Holloway struggled. "You don't understand. You have the right to an attorney." "I can make a deal." The metallic click of handcuffs cut him off. Olivia exhaled. Not in relief. Not yet. Because Sinclair was still sitting behind that bench, gripping the armrests like they might keep him in power a little longer. She turned to him, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw a man who was afraid. The courthouse doors swung open. The crisp air hit Olivia Carter's face as she stepped outside, the afternoon sun casting long, stretched shadows across the marble steps. The noise behind her, the murmurs, the camera shutters, the voices calling her name, felt distant. She had won, but she wasn't celebrating. Because as she stood there looking out at the faces beyond the flashing lights, she didn't see victory. She saw Tasha. She saw Lillian. She saw dozens of others just like them, people who had been crushed by the same system that had tried to erase her. She was free, but they weren't. Later that evening, Olivia sat alone in a small, dimly lit office. The weight of the day still pressed against her chest, but something else burned beneath it. Purpose. She opened a folder on her desk. Inside, names, dates, case numbers. Each one was a life ruined by the same corruption she had just exposed. Each one was a fight waiting to be fought. She picked up a pen. She didn't hesitate. The ink hit the paper, signing the first official document for the Carter Initiative. A new organization. A team built to investigate wrongful convictions, expose corrupt officials, and dismantle the system from the inside out. Because Olivia Carter had spent years believing in justice. Now, she was going to make sure it existed. She looked down at the words she had written, and then softly, just to herself, "I used to think the system could be fixed." A slow breath. A glance toward the stack of unopened files waiting for her. But some things aren't meant to be saved. Some things have to be torn down, so we can build something better. She closed the folder, and then her phone buzzed. A new case. A name she didn't recognize. But she would soon. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. The last scene unfolded in silence. Olivia Carter stood on the steps of the courthouse, the same place where hours ago she had been on trial. She looked up at the massive pillars of the building that had once symbolized justice to her. Not anymore. Not yet. But maybe, one day. She turned, and with steady, unwavering steps, she walked forward. Because justice wasn't a verdict. it was a fight, and hers had only just begun. What do you think? Do you believe the system can be reformed, or does it need to be rebuilt from the ground up? Let's continue the conversation in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps bring these powerful stories to more people. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story that challenges, inspires, and sparks real conversations. Your support means everything. It keeps us going, creating stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this journey.